Against the background of a cloudy sky, Panlos, the main villain of this incredible story, appears with a cigarette in his teeth. He unclenches his fist, and a dead butterfly falls out. He slowly walks along the roof of a high-rise building, dressed in his impenetrable blue-black suit, equipped with villainous gadgets and even luminous inserts. Slowly, step by step, he approaches its edge, and we understand that he is preparing to jump down. Without hesitating for a second, he confidently jumps down from a height of more than 300 meters towards a new crime. And at the very last moment, Panlos activates a flight device, which is wings covered with impenetrable material, which, cutting through the air, emit a characteristic sound. Before he has time to rise to his previous height, someone shouts to him and calls him by name. Another second, and Panlos flies down from a powerful series of blows from his opponent, who managed to immobilize him and take the initiative into his own hands. Ethan, a superhero with good intentions, tells our main character that he came only for him, and innocent residents must not be harmed during the upcoming battle, and Panlos just smirks. At the same second, a whole series of powerful explosions thundered, and we see that all the buildings were blown up, and the block before our eyes was turning into complete ruins, engulfed in fire and smoke. Panlos, with the most arrogant grin, gloated, boasting about how much effort and time he had to spend on placing all these explosives. And Ethan could no longer do anything. He only attacked the villain with screams. The hero was blinded by his rage, and this prevented him. Panlos easily repelled his attack with just a snap of his finger and continued his villainous monologue, slowly approaching Ethan lying on the ground. At that moment, he stood up and discovered a bullet in his chest. It did not go deep into the body, but got stuck in the fabric of his suit. Taking it out, he reminded Panlos that ordinary bullets could not kill him. The villain said that he knew this very well, brought his hand clenched into a fist to his mouth to hide his smile and hold back his chuckle. And the whole point was in the steering wheel. As soon as Ethan took it out, it squeaked. And while the hero did not have time to understand anything about what was happening, Panlos had already managed to fly several meters into the sky so that the burning cloud would not reach him. And because of the explosion, it turned out to be really huge. It took Ethan several minutes to come to his senses and understand what had happened. By this time, only a cloud of smoke remained from the explosion. Only his suit and a little hair were damaged. As soon as he caught his breath and collected his thoughts, he immediately flew up with a characteristic noise. He didn't even need any flying devices for this. He quickly caught up with Panlos and grabbed him. A fight broke out between them in the sky. Between blows, they still managed to exchange barbs and shout at each other. Panlos sarcastically asked if he knew why he became the target of the hunt. Ethan was terribly angry. But the villain did not let up. He said that he was in vain considered a fiend of hell and asked if he remembered the one who killed his father. This question finished off the hero, and he hit Panlos with all his might. Screaming and swearing, Ethan beat him, shouted that Panlos had no right to mention his father, and carried him through almost the entire city block with blows and explosions. This could have been the final point in their feud, but no. The villain Panlos attacked the city again and again to fight the hero Ethan. And after that, he still could not grab the speedy Panlos. He could not stop the tragedy in this city. They started talking about it even in the news. And it is not clear what motivates Ethan, complete madness or the desire to forgive the villain. A lot of people have died. Some parts of the city have been in ruins for a long time due to constant attacks. And he leaves Panlos alive over and over again. And once again, when the villain had already been captured, Ethan did not kill him, but began to listen to him. The villain asked why the hero allowed himself to be considered the watchdog of this city. Where did such devotion come from? Because it was because of her that he suffered now. Ethan proudly answered something pompous about the justice that drives him, which made Panlos laugh, who interrupted him, saying that he really had a personal grudge, and immediately attacked the distracted hero. Ethan miraculously managed to reflect several bright blue, scorching rays aimed at him, then tore out a piece of asphalt and covered himself with it. Then he threw him towards the villain, knocking him down, and then before Panlos had time to recover from such a surprise, he finished him off with a blow of his boot right in the face. The mask fell off the villain, which hid almost everything except his lips and chin. At that second, Ethan's breath caught in surprise, because Lenton, his old friend, was hiding behind the role of the sworn enemy. And while the villain rubbed his beaten face and dislocated jaw, Ethan could not come to his senses. He could not believe that for 10 years his friend had been lying to him and trying to kill him. Out of emotion, our heroes began to swear. Panlos accused Ethan of not even seeing each other in all these years, and he, in turn, stated that Simon told him everything, and Aunt Martha pledged to look after Panlos. Then began to speculate out loud that Panlos simply disappeared, and during this time he simply planned everything. Then he asked if our villain was happy now, to which Panlos just looked away. A few seconds later, without a single emotion on his face, he said a firm no. He wants Ethan to die. Ethan was confused, his eyes darting around the destroyed buildings around them. He thought about the people who were hurt. Remembering his destiny, the hero, without hesitation, gathered all his strength and sent a powerful fiery beam at Panlos, and the villain, possessing the opposite energy, began to defend himself. These were such strong, powerful streams of energy that, merging together, they caused a jump in time and transported our characters to the past. Panlos, or more correctly Lenton, woke up in the school office. For a long time he could not come to his senses and make out the conversations around him. The teacher told one of the students to call the deputy prefect. He stood up, turned around and headed to the back of the office and called Ethan. He stood surrounded by classmates. The guys listened to the story of some girl, and Lenton could not believe his eyes. He did not believe in what was happening. The main character was blazing with anger. His classmate asked if he was okay, and he muttered something under his breath, then jumped up from his seat and screamed. He stood up from his desk, holding a marker in his hands, and quickly, confidently walked towards the window. The whole class was in shock. They watched with open mouths as Lenton covered the window with some kind of calculations. The teacher interrupted him, screamed and told him to get off the windowsill and take his place, and the guy was so furious that he started shouting back at her, after which he began to talk out loud about his calculations and comment on each action in abstruse words. He was completely immersed in his thoughts, and when he came to the correct answer, he slammed his palm on the glass and turned to his classmates, who did not understand a word. Moving away from the windowsill, Lenton heard a conversation between two guys who were discussing his strange prank, turned around and called them names in a whisper. The teacher tried unsuccessfully to put him back in his place as he rummaged through his desk drawers for a weapon and still tried to come up with an explanation for what was happening. Walking to his desk, he said out loud that there was no reason to have his head in the clouds, suggested that he had been sent back in time from a time that was slightly better than his school days, and decided that he would definitely find an explanation for this. Lenton went up to the desk of one of his classmates, pulled out a stationery knife from her pencil case without permission, and rejoiced at his find. His eyes glowed with rage. He was obsessed with his idea to finish what he started, attack Ethan and kill him. The guy ran up to him, put a knife to his face, but froze literally a couple of centimeters away. Someone stopped him, grabbed him by the collar, and pulled him away from the frightened Ethan. Lenton up with incredible strength and froze in this position for a while. Ethan exhaled. He was no longer in danger. The woman pulled the bully out of the classroom by the scruff of the neck, told the students to study the topic of the lesson on their own, and they began to whisper and wonder what happened to their quiet and always gloomy classmate. She took the guy into the teacher's room, called him at home, but his uncle coldly replied that he did not have time to come for his nephew. Lenton looked at her with genuine surprise. Then she tried to talk to him, said that she knew his difficult situation and that he must study hard to free himself from all his difficulties, but the guy just turned away. After a minute of silence, he pointed his finger at the clock and said that he only had to wait a couple of seconds. The clock hand quickly ran across the dial. After a couple of seconds, nothing happened. Lenton looked arrogantly and questioningly at his teacher, and she was seriously concerned about the behavior of her ward. Then he explained that the events of the near future do not have any meaning for him, that the future he will return to the past with a time machine to stop himself. The teacher was shocked. She could barely find the right words and asked if he had read any science fiction books lately, but he did not listen to her, but continued to insist on his own. He said that if a time machine ever appears in the future, it will be only thanks to him and that no one dares to doubt him. The woman listened to this, exhaled and began to calm him down, saying that she was glad of his sudden zeal for study, because before he had not listened to more than one lecture. But then she noticed that the guy was already at the exit from the teaching room. Lenton wandered along the old street. He never thought that one day he would return to this dirty place. All this was locked in the depths of his memory. He opened the lock and made his way inside the basement. He walked along the corridor to the room, thinking that his universal quantum weapon took him back to the past. He did not know that this could happen due to a malfunction of the machine, but he was sure that this was not an accident, that his return definitely made sense. that this time no one and nothing would stop him from killing Ethan. And even if in this reality he is too weak to confront the hero, he can still win this battle, because the hero has not yet awakened his powers. And while the villain, oblivious to reality, was pondering his insidious plans, there was a knock on his door. He jumped up from the table, turned around, and almost fell from surprise. Aunt Martha stood on the threshold of the room. She had a sweet smile on her face. Her hair was a little disheveled. She was dressed in old, washed, but still neat things. She asked what her nephew was doing. Aunt Martha called her nephew to the table. It was modest, without a wide variety of dishes, but its main decoration was a birthday cake with candles in the shape of the number 17. Ethan didn't pay him any attention. He stood there with his eyes wide open and his mouth agape, and then asked how she survived. The woman considered this a bad joke and pulled the boy by the ear, trying to bring him to his senses and shake all the crap out of him. She did not understand what kind of nonsense he was talking about. Then she took out a knife. Lenton was seriously scared. The woman sternly told him not to dare talk to his uncle in such a tone, and then finally offered to try the cake. Not even a couple of minutes had passed before there was a terrible crash. A man's shoe flew into the wall. A drunk man shouted something about money, demanding to know where it was hidden. Martha shielded her nephew and ordered him to go to his room, but from one look it was clear that he decided to do otherwise. Drunk Uncle Joe shouted that it was all over, but he knew very well about the money he had saved up and hidden somewhere in the house. Frightened, Martha tried to explain that this was money for Lenton's education, but they did not listen to her and demanded that she give it back. The woman remembered that last time her husband did not return the money he took, and she understood that she would have nothing to pay for the boy's education. Uncle Joe fell on his knees in front of her and cried. He begged her to forgive him for everything, asked for forgiveness for his drinking and gambling. He swore love and fidelity to his wife, promised to improve, said that as soon as luck turned his way, everything would work out for them. He grabbed Martha's legs, looked into her eyes with hope, begged her to give him money, but she remained adamant, saying through her teeth that she could not allow him to take such risks. The woman hugged her husband and also began to cry. She begged him not to place any more bets, because even if he won, this amount would still be much less than the one he lost, and the accumulated money would be enough for them to live a normal life. At that moment, the man lost his temper, looked at his wife with eyes full of hatred, jumped to his feet and hit her in the face with all his might. Poor Martha could not stand on her feet and fell, knocking over the table. Joe shouted at her, blamed her for all his troubles, and did not notice anything around her. Lenton stood behind him with a stony face. His uncle told him that now his aunt's life depended only on him, and he continued to beat her. He grabbed her by the hair, hit her in the face, while the boy watched this whole nightmare with anger. Joe shouted that she had no right to buy expensive products if they were not intended for him, forcibly stuffed food into her mouth, and Lenton was already standing behind him with a knife in his hands. Martha begged to stop and let her go, tried to break free, and Lenton slowly approached his uncle's back. At the last moment, he turned the blade of the knife back. The uncle turned around and the guy smiled, handed him the knife, and told him to kill his aunt. Lenton's cry, he asked what his uncle was waiting for, and thrust a knife into his palm. He ordered that the woman's throat be cut, or a knife thrust into her heart, and he pushed his hand with the weapon straight towards the aunt's face, distorted in horror. The uncle had little determination, but the guy did not back down, continued to egg him on, pushing him to kill. Joe dropped the knife. All three watched as it hit the floor. Martha exhaled at that moment, her heart pounding. And Lenton began to mock the would-be killer, calling him soft, a coward, and a weakling. The uncle was still controlled by alcohol. He did not understand very well what he was doing. He knocked the guy down, hit his head on the floor. Lenton lost consciousness. Lying in his own blood, he thought that everything was not so bad. In his past life, there had been worse evenings. Joe shouted that he would teach this boy to talk to elders and beat him without stopping, and Martha grabbed his hands and tried to stop him. As soon as the guy came to his senses a little, he tried to cover his face with his hand from the blow. This brought the uncle to his senses, and he stopped and promised to spare the guy today. Leaving the room, he ordered Martha and Lenton to pack their things because the landlord would soon come, and the aunt rushed to examine her nephew. The boy stood up and immediately took hold of the knife. This seriously frightened his aunt, and he smiled. Lenton chuckled and tapped the knife on his head. It turned out to be fake. The guy just managed to replace it in time. This, of course, calmed the aunt, but she warned that if his uncle found out about this, he would get even more angry. Lenton decided to tell his aunt a story. Once upon a time, there lived a king who ruled a rich and stable country on the seashore. One day, his most faithful and reliable wizard predicted that when the golden star burned in the sky again, the king would die. The angry and frightened king decided to avoid the tragedy. He took people and food and went to the mountains. As time passed and supplies began to run out, in despair, the king began to go crazy. He began to eat his people and drink their blood. To save people, the queen gave the king her blood to drink, to which she added strong poison. He drank it and died instantly. On this day, the golden star rose again into the heavens. Aunt Martha felt very sorry for this king, and Lenton fundamentally disagreed with her. He considered him a coward and an idiot. The woman was very worried about the future, because the guy still needed to finish school, and she didn't know where to go now. Lenton was not so worried about this. He was glad that his uncle had a fake knife in his hands, because in the past, due to the death of his aunt, everything had gone wrong. He thought about his time machine, about how everything would turn out this time, what his fate would lead to. After he was reborn, he had already managed to change one terrible event that was about to happen. He made an oath to himself, promised to change everything he could. At school, on an ordinary clear day, students tried to remove traces of Lenton's writing as quickly as possible. A young girl called the teacher and warned that the famous Professor Luke Bush from the Polytechnic School wanted to visit their class today. This news was clearly not pleasant. Our teacher was infuriated by this news. She almost started shouting at the children when she suddenly turned around and froze. Near the scribbled window sat a strangely dressed man with funny glasses and disheveled hair. He could not tear himself away from the formulas, looked at and praised each of them, and did not even give the opportunity to say hello and introduce himself. A few seconds later, he jumped off the windowsill and asked who wrote all this. The teacher replied that her student Lenton did it. The professor turned back to the window and quietly muttered that he had finally found him. Lenton sat in a dark room, trying to fix something and thinking about his further plan of action. He needed to kill Ethan, but without attracting attention. He remembered his acquaintances who were devoted to him, or rather to Panlos. They often joked that to defeat Ethan he needed to be younger. What luck. After all, this is exactly what happened now, and if he doesn't manage to cope with it on his own, then maybe his old acquaintances can help. He found Miranda first. She was clearly very surprised by this, but she didn't show it and continued smoking calmly. Lenton remembered how they met in the past, how she told him about Diagon Alley, because in her youth she herself had often been there. This became the answer. The guy quickly voiced his proposal. Contract killings had long ceased to amaze her, but she demanded an increase in cost. The young lady showed him the number 5. It turned out that it was not 50,000, as he immediately thought, but 5 million, an unaffordable amount for him. So he turned around and left. Lenton returned to his basement, continued to tinker with the time machine, and think about who else could be offered a contract killing. One candidate came to mind. But when he found an old acquaintance, it turned out that now his hobby was not killing, but selling incense in the temple. The enraged guy simply left without explanation. Watching the cherry blossoms, he continued to go through the options. The only one left came to mind. His code name is H. His gender is unknown. His age is unknown. Even his face without a mask is unknown. While the guy was lost in his thoughts, someone snatched the piece of paper from his hands. Standing in front of him was a cheeky girl, whom he recognized as the future Sarah. The girl made fun of him and then asked why he spied on Ethan yesterday. Sarah noticed a patch on his cheek and remembered that he did not like to show his weaknesses and illnesses. She reached for the patch. She ordered Lenton not to twitch and to remain silent, because he was harming himself, and she knew how to help. She began to draw a cross on his patch and say special words. This was not the first time Lenton had experienced this. This moment seemed magical. He himself didn't notice how he finished Sarah's sentence, which greatly surprised her. They couldn't take their eyes off each other, but they were helped in this by a ball that flew right into the guy's face. He tried to fight him off, but instead he fell onto the steps. Sarah helped him get up. 2 guys approached them and threw a couple of taunts at Lenton. But when they called him a weakling, he got really angry, but didn't show it. In contrast, Sarah, who began to shout at the 2, confidently approached them. But the dialogue clearly would not have worked out, so Lenton handed them the ball and said that it was okay. He handed the ball to the bully, who clearly felt superior, but he didn't give it away, but dodged it, which caused a violent reaction. This made the offender terribly angry, and he pressed Lenton against the wall and began shouting at him. Our hero poked the ball in his opponent's face, for which he received a strong blow to the stomach. The guy said that he himself would teach him to respect his elders, and that same smile appeared on Lenton's face. Another second, and the laugh on the hooligan's face gave way to horror. He raised his head and couldn't believe his eyes. A pillar was flying towards him. A bunch of people quickly came running in response to the noise. Lenton explained to them that it was just an accident, and they began to help the victim. Sarah asked how he did it, and he pretended that he didn't understand what she was talking about. As the bully was being carried away, Lenton noticed one interesting detail: his tattoo. It was painfully familiar. Panlos gave another order to Eich, warning him that the new enemy was much stronger. This obviously did not frighten him, but Panlos, instead of a new mission, advised him to stay at home and rest, which Eich was not at all happy about. Then Panlos first noticed an interesting tattoo on him. Lenton couldn't get thoughts about Eich out of his head and decided to distract himself with a delicious flatbread. When his order was almost ready, he was distracted from lunch by Ethan himself. Lenton was not at all happy about this meeting, and he showed it with all his appearance, stopping any attempts by Ethan to start a dialogue, but he did not give up. He picked up his order and left, but Ethan tagged along. He came specifically to talk about that knife incident at school. Ethan looked with eyes full of surprise at his friend, or rather his best friend, and could not understand what had happened to him. Suddenly, a crowd of strange men ran past them screaming. They shouted something to them. The guys noticed a strange backpack. Lenton looked after them, when suddenly Ethan put his hand on his shoulder and said that he would not leave him here alone. He said that these were clearly criminals who were clearly up to something wrong. Lenton did not argue. While they were talking, there was a loud explosion and the hospital was blown up. But this had never happened in Lenton's past. The only thing that was known about this hospital was that there was only one doctor in it. This was clearly a cover for something. A real panic began in the crowd around. The boys noticed how an unknown person was trying to rob a woman. Ethan was about to rush to save people, but he was stopped by his friend. A brilliant idea came into his head. He suggested they split up, he would stay outside, and Ethan would help outside. Ethan thanked his friend and immediately rushed inside. The villainous plan began to be carried out. Lenton's gloating knew no bounds. He so hoped that there would be more bombs in the hospital. And then he will finally get rid of Ethan. It's just a pity that they didn't say goodbye. Ethan asked a friend to call the class teacher and say that the explosion occurred in the hospital where Harvey was lying. Then Lenton was seized with shock because Harvey would become H in the future. It was impossible to lose him. A few minutes before the explosion, Harvey and his friends were discussing taking Lenton into account. Then everything began to shake, as if from an earthquake, and everyone was seriously scared. A nurse ran into the room and told me to urgently evacuate. The two friends ran away, leaving their friend alone with a broken leg. He tried to get up on his own, but fell out of bed. After several attempts, he got out into the corridor and saw the whole nightmare that was going on there. Everyone was running around the corridors. Children were crying. The siren was screaming. Lenton approached Harvey from behind and asked if he liked what was happening, how to watch it. He grabbed him by the face and ordered him to look closely. Harvey sent him. He repeated the same question several times until tears appeared on the guy's face. Harvey admitted that he had not felt anything for a long time and remembered his childhood. The image of his little sister was spinning in his head. She looked at him in bewilderment, and he was holding a dead bird in his hands. There was not a single emotion on his face. The girl became scared and ran away, leaving her brother alone. Soon my sister died, and Harvey didn't shed a tear at the funeral. He only placed the body of the chick in her coffin. Then he burst into tears, not from the pain of loss, but from fear of himself. He himself caused the death of his sister. This sin will remain with him for the rest of his life. He was ashamed of his thoughts all his life, tried to control his emotions, but nothing worked. And then support came from Lenton. He put a ring on Harvey's finger and said that he was not oppressed, but was born this way. Harvey looked at the two traitors under the rubble. Lenton watched silently, their fate sealed. Lenton helped the guy figure out the new weapon, pressed the ring and plasma lightning flew out of it. It was a terrible force, capable of destroying anything. The guys were pretty scared. Lenton pushed him to commit violence, and his former friends began to beg for mercy. But Harvey was determined. Forgiving betrayal was clearly not his style. Then he turned to Lentona and asked if it was with this ring that he cut the flagpole, and why he planned all this. He grabbed Harvey's face and said that he was the only one who could understand his true nature as a villain. He ordered to immediately shoot and announce himself to the whole world. At such a tense moment, Ethan interrupted them and said that they needed to run away as soon as possible. At the end of the corridor, a sullen man dressed in all black walked confidently with a cigarette in his teeth. Two traitors under the rubble mistook him for a policeman and asked for help, but he didn't even glance in their direction. Walked by and blew them up. Harvey couldn't believe it. He approached our heroes. Ethan asked what he needed, and instead of answering, he received a kick in the face. He flew several meters away. The next obstacle in the man's path was Lenton, sitting on the floor motionless. Then he suddenly raised his head and couldn't hold back a cry of delight. Then he asked to kick Ethan one more time. Lenton told him that he knew very well that he had planted bombs, captured a group of people, and intended to destroy the real target with it. And now he had disguised himself as a policeman in order to check without suspicion whether everything had been successful. Harvey could not understand anything, and Lenton ordered him to listen carefully and remember, because in the future this knowledge would be useful to him. Said there are 3 reasons why such people might wear a cloak. It's convenient to hide a weapon there. It moves coolly in the wind, and it's convenient to carry a photo of your target in its pockets. And he pulled out a photo of Harvey from the man's pocket. They were both very surprised. Lenton said that the man's boss wants Harvey dead, and he's just fulfilling an order, and the coat is too big for him. This infuriated the man. He ordered him to shut up and pointed his weapon at him. The guy was not taken aback, hit him and knocked the blaster off his hand. Then he picked him up and wondered why he was using such an outdated weapon. The man became very embarrassed and said that he had no money at all. Lenton was surprised by this even more, because he was sure that at this time they paid a lot for murder, but it turned out that this was not the case. The man, on behalf of his boss, invited the guy to work together. Lenton promised to think about it. The man handed him a business card and was about to introduce himself when a bullet passed through his temple. The guy turned around and saw a girl in front of him. She said that she couldn't stand schemers, and she could have completed this task much faster than her colleague. It was a young girl in a tight and very revealing leather suit. Her name was Abby. Harvey didn't even have time to blink an eye when he found himself chained to the wall by some kind of web, and the girl threatened him not to move. In a rage, he began to shout at her, saying that she could not kill him and took it weakly. But she didn't even bat an eyebrow, put the gun to his neck, and was ready to pull the trigger, but something distracted her. A barely alive Ethan grabbed her ankle. She sat down and examined the guy, squeezed his ribs and concluded that there were no intact ones left, and his right hand didn't move at all. Abby smiled mischievously and promised that they would have a lot of fun when she killed his boyfriend. She was about to return to her work, but Ethan grabbed her leg again. This angered her, and she hit his face on the floor. She delivered another blow to the head with her knee. Harvey could not calmly watch this, but he also could not escape. She enjoyed every blow, breaking bones, twisting her arms. Harvey screamed. He shouted that he hated Ethan, that there would be no gratitude from someone like him, and it would all be in vain. Ethan said he hated Harvey. He hated all people who hurt others, but they themselves didn't deserve it either. Abby grabbed his hair and with genuine pleasure continued to torment him, reminding him that in this state he was unlikely to be able to do anything, and Ethan did not deny this. When Abby realized that something was wrong, it was already too late. Lenton picked up the blaster and without hesitation or regret, shot her. He even had enough self-confidence and arrogance to mock his opponent. He said that she slowed down much more than her colleague. Harvey watched all this with his mouth wide open, and Lenton did not miss the moment to emphasize that he was not the only one who was crazy. Continuing to play around with the new toy, he began a long monologue about morality, justice, strength, and weakness. He carefully cut the web and freed Harvey, joking that at such a young age he had already managed to make such enemies for himself. Lenton approached Ethan to check if he was alive at all, kicked him, he lay face down on the ground and did not move at all. And then the guy thought that he could kill him now and blame everything on this crazy girl. The flow of his thoughts was interrupted by a web flying towards him, and then by its angry owner. The malicious smile on her face was no longer there. She said that the lives of a couple of naughty guys had no value for her, after which she grabbed the gun again. But she quickly lowered it. Her hand was wounded by something. It was Harvey. He took advantage of Lenton's gift. The guy said that she was just pretending to be someone unknown, and she was killing people for money, doing the most humiliating work. He thanked Ethan and Lenton for helping him understand himself while they were still sitting in the web. Harvey shouted that she had no right to harm innocent people and should be punished for it and prepared to shoot. Lenton freed himself from the web and watched everything that was happening. He could not understand what was happening to his villainous puppet. Everything was not going according to plan at all. It shocked him. Harvey shot at Abby over and over again, and no matter how hard he tried, he still couldn't hit her. She dodged surprisingly quickly. He didn't understand how a girl who had just woken up could move so fast. As soon as he was distracted for a second, she immediately dealt a strong blow to the stomach. She continued to beat him, who was already lying on the floor, kicking him in the face as hard as she could. This development of events, to put it mildly, did not bother him. He could not afford to be beaten by some woman. With the last of his strength, he stood up and shouted that he could not let her go, especially after she showed her true colors. It was too presumptuous. Abby took advantage of the moment and sent him with one kick to the far corner of the room. Ethan was sincerely worried about Harvey, and Lenton was trying to figure out a way to get rid of his sworn enemy as quickly as possible. The first option was to kill him now and put the blame on Abby. Even if he told the police the truth, she would be considered crazy, because he is now just an innocent high school student. At first glance, this is the optimal solution, but there are a lot of risks. There is video surveillance in the hospital, there may be witnesses, and there will be no fingerprints on the murder weapon. Of course, the end justifies the means, but it was scary to even imagine what would happen if he was discovered. Lenton's favor: if she kills Harvey, she will simply quickly run away. Abby was already reloading the gun for the final shot when he screamed and asked him to stop. He rose to his feet, stared at her, and Ethan, sitting next to him in shock, could only mumble his friend's name. He said that she cannot kill an innocent person. He, and especially his friend, will not allow this. Inwardly, he couldn't stop praising his excellent acting skills, but Abby was less than impressed. Lenton continued to look at her searchingly, while Ethan expected at least some explanation from him. Then, realizing that he was called a friend, he almost burst into tears right there. Lenton, with such hope and joy in his eyes, he only asked if he could stand. For some reason, I stroked his hand and decided that he would be bait. He pulled Ethan's hand too hard, and it seemed that he almost tore it out. Something in his shoulder crunched loudly. The guy screamed. Abby was still doing her job, so she was pretty tired of this circus. She wanted to get out of here as soon as possible. Without hesitation or unnecessary thought, she opened fire on them, dozens of bullets rushing towards them at once. At this moment, the guys quickly found their bearings as never before, pressed their backs to each other, and were ready to take this blow. When suddenly ordinary bullets turned into spiders, Ethan was seriously frightened, and Lenton just grinned. Ethan, like a true hero, did not forget about his friend, and our actor burst into tears at the sight of scary spiders. Ethan hid it behind his back and swore to protect it. This clearly made Lenton happy. A swarm of spiders instantly stuck to the poor fellow. They clung to absolutely everything. The actor of the burnt theater ran around and carefully warned about more and more spiders. Abby did not understand what was happening. Ethan suddenly grabbed his arm, pulled him towards him, and told him not to panic. Lenton exhaled with relief, because he was afraid that he had been exposed. Ethan tore a piece of some kind of material from the wall, and with one sharp movement brushed away all the spiders. His joy knew no bounds, but Lenton, on the contrary, was seething with rage. And he's not the only one. Abby was already starting to worry, because the mission was taking too long. The boss definitely wouldn't like it. She decided to finish here quickly, and called all the spiders to her. These mini-robots increased several times in size and number in a fraction of a second. At some point, even Lenton became nervous, and for good reason, because now a giant spider robot stood in front of them. A huge killing machine with frightening red eyes stood above them. The stupor was interrupted unexpectedly quickly when this something tried to crush Lenton. Fortunately, Ethan came to the rescue and pushed him aside. He quickly realized that hesitation was dangerous and began to shoot at him with a blaster. This surprised Ethan so much, he thought that he would have to protect his friend. The shots flew at the spider one after another, creating powerful explosions. But it was a very durable machine made of titanium alloy and remote-controlled. Lenton realized that this thing would easily finish off Ethan. But was it worth letting it happen now? Perhaps he himself will have a hard time without the help of a friend. A plan has matured in his head. But then Ethan asked him to distract our crazy woman for a while. The guy was clearly not happy about this. With a couple of banal phrases, he tried to support his friend. He had no choice but to obey. They were quickly separated by a giant paw with one blow. Lenton managed to jump away, but he didn't see what happened to his friend, and he was seriously scared for him. Ethan rushed to attack today's main villain. She did not expect such a turn and seriously tensed. Using the remote control, she managed to quickly unhook the guy from her. He took advantage of the moment and grabbed Harvey, who was lying unconscious. He took him to the far corner and ordered him to hide here while they distract the spider. Harvey didn't have time to understand what kind of spider was threatening them when his heart almost sank from the mere sight of it from afar. The guy lost consciousness again. Ethan didn't know what to do now, how to save his friends. At this time, Lenton fought with the huge monster with all his strength. He got caught in his paw and almost became a cake, but managed to dodge it when he suddenly noticed something very important. It was an inertial sensor. It could be their key to victory. Lenton, not thinking about the consequences, began to try to break it. Ethan was already running screaming to save him. The guy, without strength or signs of life, fell to the floor. He would have been crushed by something if not for our hero. Ethan had time to think that he had lost his friend forever. He apologized, mumbled some excuses about how he only wanted to save Harvey. Lenton opened his eyes and said that he had always been and would be like this. He would want to save everyone, but he would not have enough strength to do everything at once. And in the end, he would be able to save no one, not even himself. The sensor on his blaster made a sharp sound. Such words would have shocked anyone. Ethan realized his helplessness and weakness, realized that he had no strength at all. Tears flowed down his cheeks. Abby was shaking with anger. She couldn't believe they were still moving. She immediately gave the command to her deadly toy. His sharp metal paw rushed towards the guys, approached Ethan's back and almost pierced him. His eyes glowed. He stopped the monster with one hand and bent the steel. Then he waved his hand and threw back this huge machine. It was difficult even for Lenton to believe his eyes. The spider fell right on top of its owner and crushed her. He couldn't believe that Ethan's powers had awakened so quickly and unexpectedly, ruining his entire plan. This would be the perfect opportunity to kill Ethan and put all the blame on this woman. Lenton rose from the floor, wiped the blood from his face with his hand, watching as Ethan broke the spider with precise blows. Although now the plan had failed miserably, he still had a whole year ahead of him to kill him. Ethan finished with the spider, turned it into a pile of scrap metal, and headed towards Lenton. He seriously tensed, clenched his fists, and prepared to defend himself. He, forgetting all caution, pressed the button on his weapon. An image of their past, or more correctly, their future, surfaced in his thoughts. Ethan was practically exhausted and slowly trudged towards his friend. And he, blinded by hatred, was preparing to shoot. And he fired when the distance between them became too small. It was a very powerful explosion, after which no one could survive. But Ethan could. This became clear when the clouds of dust and smoke cleared. Lenton fired again with even greater power. And again nothing, only Ethan's clothes were damaged. The guy was seriously scared. The problem was no longer killing the enemy. With the power of thought, he lifted all the objects surrounding him. In the past, when Ethan's power awakened, he leveled everything within a 2-kilometer radius in an unconscious state. Lenton remembered this very well. The guy grabbed his hand and pulled him towards him. His eyes were shining brightly. He was clearly not himself. It cost him nothing to break the blaster, the only weapon Lenton could use to defend himself. For a minute, they both froze, stood motionless, hands touching. Events of the past came to mind, conversations about the future over a bottle of beer. Lenton then asked his friend why he wanted to become a superhero. He replied that many people believe that after receiving superpowers, he took on the responsibility of saving the world. But this is not so. And then the hero admitted that he was not so selfless. All this was created because of the small desire of a selfish child. Ethan is engulfed in the blue light of his power, but remains motionless against the chaos surrounding them. The only thing Lenton had left was a little hope, but he still decided to try. He leaned towards his friend's ear and whispered something to him. At that moment, consciousness returned to him. His eyes and his whole body stopped glowing. He didn't come to his senses right away, of course, because he was terrified. From extreme fatigue and shock, he fainted and fell to the ground. Lenton did not catch him. He stood with his mouth open over his body. He couldn't believe what he had accomplished. Long years of planning and failures. I even had to pretend to be his best friend. He picked up a rock from the ground, but only managed to cut Ethan's hand. He himself fell to his knees. He had been waiting for this moment for so long. He had done so much to achieve his goal. He grabbed his head and screamed from the storm of emotions inside. He took the stone in his hands, said goodbye to the hero forever, and was ready to strike the final blow. They were not alone in the building. The murder was interrupted by a policeman pointing a gun at them. Without hesitation, the guy threw out the stone and froze in anticipation. He pretended to be very frightened and was simply trying to wake up his classmate. There was a police detachment throughout the hospital. Ambulances were parked on the street. Doctors were trying to save survivors of the explosion. Ethan was placed on a gurney, and Lenton, sitting next to the nurse, invented saws for himself. But in his thoughts, he thought about only one thing, about this chance to deal with the enemy, which he missed. The adult Ethan recalled how, for the first time after activating his superpowers, he led a very ordinary lifestyle. He shared this with what he thought was his best friend, but he didn't care. He was just waiting for the right moment to ask about his weaknesses. Ethan completely ignored the pretense and admired their perfect friendship. The insidious Lenton took full advantage of this. He only created the appearance of a warm relationship, dreaming of murder. 12 days have passed since returning to the past. The weather outside was disgusting. Life went on as usual, but this brought terrible boredom to our main character. Like a typical teenager, he argued with his aunt and didn't want to dress for the weather. He was not afraid of the possible health problems that Martha spoke about. He was sometimes openly rude to her, forgetting that now he was an ordinary schoolboy and not the villain Panlos. Aunt Martha tried to influence the boy in every way, and often she succeeded. A dissatisfied and sad teenager trudged to class in the company of his girlfriend. Sarah very emotionally wondered why her friend had so suddenly turned into a genius and suggested that it was due to a split personality. Lenton had been listening to this nonsense for the last 10 minutes, but it felt like his head was about to explode. At school, everything was boring and tedious as usual. Nothing happened. Classmates, divided into groups, chatted about all sorts of nonsense. He thought about why he had to endure all this dullness, because he had only one desire, to kill people. Sarah came up with another version, according to which the guy is actually already 35 years old. He was simply rejuvenated with the help of some kind of poison. This joke made him nervous for a minute. It was not so far from the truth. He assumed the most serious look and rudely asked the girl to shut up. It's obvious that this really hurt her. She leaned over him and blurted out that he was hiding something. She continued to talk out loud about how he used to be quiet. But in recent days, he has become too noticeable and active, and Lenton wondered how he had not noticed her insight before. He remained ostentatiously calm, which infuriated Sarah even more. She grabbed his face with her hands and quietly asked what exactly happened. Removing the girl's hands, he just as quietly replied that the previous one was too pathetic. He had no qualities, with a constant feeling that life was hateful and was dragging him into the abyss. He thought about death. These words greatly frightened Sarah, but the guy assured that he no longer thinks so because a goal has appeared in his life. On a clear sunny day, laughter could be heard in the schoolyard, and in his gym, Harvey worked out all alone. Suddenly, someone interrupted him. It was Lenton. He asked if the guy knew the man who tried to kill him, to which he received a negative answer. Lenton sat down on the floor and began to come up with a variety of motives, because of which they could try to kill Harvey. Then he added that a couple of push-ups won't get rid of all the killers. Of course, for a first-class villain, strength is important, but his intelligence is much more important. Harvey didn't get it the first time, but Lenton didn't stop trying to reach him. The guy got up from the floor and said that he didn't see any benefit in studying. This surprised our hero, to put it mildly, because he was able to build his entire life only thanks to his knowledge. And he began to convince the guy, saying that without studying, he would become another thick-headed bandit, a consumable item for the owner. But if he acquires the necessary knowledge, he will become the #1 villain in the world. Harvey was not very impressed by the motivational speech. He simply turned around and walked towards the exit, which infuriated Lenton. It was the third day after the explosion in the hospital. Our main character spent almost all his time studying. He remembered that he needed to eliminate all impossibilities, no matter how unthinkable the remaining ones were. I remembered how, during the evacuation from the hospital, I pulled the transmitter out of Abby's ear. He was able to fix it and set it up. A signal went out, and someone on the other end asked how the competition went. Lenton responded, causing shock to the man talking to him. The guy decided to just entertain himself and offered his interlocutor a deal. Before the main character became a villain, he thought that the killers were very mysterious. But then he realized that they were all soulless and lousy. A killer nicknamed One Shot was aiming from the window of an abandoned building. The name completely described him. He took the most convenient position to kill the victim, who turned out to be Harvey. Before he had time to pull the trigger, the sight blocked the human eye. Some young guy hung upside down and covered the sight with his finger. He closed the muzzle with a tiny ball. The man was seized with panic. He frantically pulled the trigger, but there was no shot. And then the gun exploded. The guy on the rope managed to jump out of the building. Lenton once again saved Harvey from death. By the way, he was the one who killed this maniac even before his rebirth. He hobbled home in splendid solitude along deserted narrow streets, surrounded by crows. Behind him was his tail, Mortar, the champion of the underground boxing ring who has no equal. The boxing style is tough, aggressive, intimidating, and the strength is enough to break a stone wall. In their future, in the summer, on vacation in Italy, they somehow crossed paths. But now is clearly not the time to be nostalgic for old friendship. Lenton almost received a fatal blow from behind. But knowing her tactics, he managed to dodge and grab something from the pocket of his polo. Seeing this device, Mortera froze and tried to ask something, but she couldn't muster a clear speech. And when the red dot from the laser sight appeared in the very center of her forehead, she began to beg for mercy. Behind the guy, pleased with himself, several dozen eyes were burning, and in his hands he was holding the most ordinary laser pointer, a toy for cats. About 30 cats rushed to the red dot and jumped on the girl, who began to run. Panlos exists to kill Ethan, but when entering the villainous circle, you need to know your enemy and yourself well. After all, murderers are people too, which means that they also have their weaknesses. Pleased with his intelligence, Lenton sat on the ground and stroked the street cat. Arriving home, he again contacted the mysterious man with the help of Abby's receiver. He did not understand what goals the guy was pursuing. He began to explain himself, promising not to interfere but rather to help the game, but on the condition that he choose the victim himself. The man said that the game had never been made public and asked how the guy knew about it. It was the Kosovo game, the logo of which was etched in Lenton's memory like a bright picture. This is a deadly competition within the Kosovo company, the goal of which is to identify the most promising individuals and remove weak employees. On the day of the competition, the organizing committee announces candidates for the role of victims via the darknet. The one who kills the victim wins a medal and 5 million. The man changed his tone and said that since the guy knew about the game, he clearly knew that he was talking to the head of this company, and threats were clearly out of place here. Lenton arrogantly stated that it had been 3 days since the incident in the hospital, but there had been no successful attempts to kill him, and he added that he had already threatened and challenged, undermining his authority. It was impossible to tolerate such rudeness. The man threw the phone at the wall. It shattered into small pieces. All these were observed by the killers who had been crippled by the boy, who had tried to remove him the day before. They were both very worried about their reputation and career, because such an incident could completely ruin it. They looked at each other. It seemed like the same ideas came to their minds. The man said it was a nearly 6-foot middle-aged man, and the girl added that his strength is 10 times greater than hers. They described a real monster, and not an inconspicuous teenage schoolboy who demolishes everything and everyone in his path. And then, the man suggested that this could be the same killer hunter who once killed 300 of his enemies in one night. Before they had time to invent a couple more fantastic stories, 2 shots rang out and their lives were cut short. Lester, the head of the Kosovo company, did not tolerate useless employees and always said goodbye to them easily. The door opened behind him and a ray of light entered the room. A little girl of angelic appearance appeared in the doorway and quietly called out to her dad. He squatted down and gently asked why she came in, because she was told to wait outside. The girl said that she was hungry. He took his daughter by the hand and led her out of the room, asking what she wanted. 2 corpses were left lying in an empty, cold, dark room. In the middle of the night, little Leah entered there. She folded her hands near her face in some strange gesture. Then she closed her eyes and reached out with her palm to the cold body. Of Lenton appeared before her eyes. She clearly knew him. What she saw unpleasantly surprised her. Another school day, the class was noisy with the children's carefree conversations. The teacher interrupted the fun by slamming her hand on her desk and screaming. She started the lesson with the usual organizational moments, announced upcoming events, but Sarah was thinking about something completely different. Another news was the arrival of a physics professor who recruits gifted students. Lenton became a candidate in their class. When everyone's attention turned in his direction, everyone noticed that the guy was fast asleep, his head down on the desk. This infuriated the teacher, and she threw a piece of chalk at him. The guy caught it without looking. Then he raised his head, stretched imposingly, yawned widely, and said that he would not go anywhere. He was clearly testing his teacher's nerves, and she could not agree with his decision. She took a breath and told the class the news that a new girl was transferring to them. She skipped a year of study, so she is 2 years younger than the others. Leah entered the class. She introduced herself modestly, but clearly made an impression. The teacher showed her where she could sit and continued teaching the lesson. The girl went to her desk, collecting admiring glances from her classmates. Her gaze fell on Lenton lying on the desk. She tried to touch him, but the guy felt it and raised his head, which greatly embarrassed Leah. Everyone finally waited until the end of the lesson and perked up during the break. Lenton left the office into the corridor and headed somewhere, the girl following on his heels. When she came within arm's reach, she tried to touch again, but the guy dodged. And then Sarah pulled her back. She asked if it was too hot to wear gloves in this weather. It was an attempt to start a friendly dialogue. She talked about the committee she was on, asked her to sign on some list, and tried to hug Leah, but she walked away. This surprised Sarah. She immediately apologized. Their conversation was interrupted by classmates who were also collecting signatures. This made Sarah very angry, and while she was screaming at her subordinates, Leah went to look for her target. I ran into his office. He was standing at the cooler getting water. As soon as he extended his hand, the guy grabbed her wrist. He turned and hissed angrily so that she would not dare to use her ability on him. He threatened to break her neck, leaned even closer to her ear, and asked if she understood him. The girl was very embarrassed. Her legs were trembling and her cheeks were red, but she nodded in the affirmative. It was not clear who she was and what she needed from our main character. There were quick steps and pleas for mercy, and then a shot, a pool of blood spreading across the floor. Blood flowed into the next room through the crack under the door. A movie about witches and vampires was playing on the big TV screen. Leah watched this snotty and banal melodrama with admiration, devouring popcorn. A male vampire kissed his beloved witch. She looked at it with such admiration, she so wanted to experience something like that. She then took out a high school admissions flyer. Her transfer documents were submitted and signed. The very next day, Leah stood in the corridor of this school and secretly watched Lenton. All she knew about him was that he drove her father crazy, so he became enemy number one for life. The girl had a clear plan in her head, according to which she would make him fall in love with her, and then reveal her true face. Finally, she will receive her forbidden love, and when he has had enough of playing with him, he will allow his father to kill him. According to her memories, he was angry and arrogant, but in life he turned out to be so ordinary in appearance. With her head in the clouds, she listened to the teacher's entire speech, and when she entered the class, she charmed everyone with her appearance. She considered each of those present to be nothing more than a pawn in her game. The only one who really interested her was now sleeping on her desk. She decided that this was a great time to find out more about him. The guy's muscles were tense, the corners of his lips were sharp, but his breathing and pulse indicated that he was actually sleeping. Leah looked at him with admiration. He seemed very strong to her. She was delighted just by looking at him. Her heart began to beat twice as fast. Sitting at her desk, she wrote down everything she knew about Lenton on a piece of paper. From the resulting list, she concluded that he was the ideal, typical protagonist. But she was very worried about Lenton's childhood love, Sarah. She thought to herself that in her love story, the girl would only be a minor character. A new attempt to find out something about your beloved. Leah wanted to find the deepest and most terrible secret in his heart in order to tame the guy. She was sure that even if he died, he would still never know that she had a superpower. But at that moment, the same intense dialogue took place between them. Leah simply melted from this. Her heart was pounding wildly and her body did not obey at all. Another day at school, the silence was broken by Sarah's screams. She was very worried about the upcoming sports games. Her dream was to become famous, so she tried to be the first and best in everything, a real perfectionist. Lenton suggested that she become a lawyer to defend the most harmful villain. She even liked this idea, and then someone asked to sign him up for sports games. The girl pushed Lenton away with delight. But when I saw that Leah wanted to participate in the games, I was very surprised. She added one previously unconsidered detail to her plan. She needed to attract the guy's attention. And that same guy, the object of her dreams, stood silently on the sidelines. Sarah began to offer Leah various sports disciplines, shot put, javelin throwing, jumping, but she couldn't do any of these. Then she proudly declared that she had no equal in ballet and horse riding. Lenton tried to interrupt this meaningless dialogue, saying that she was no longer at her elite school. But Sarah did not allow him to do this. She took Leah's hand and praised her for her positive attitude and enthusiasm. Sarah invited her to try herself in everything one by one and took her to the stadium, at the same time imposing her services as a tutor. She gave the command to run, thinking about how she could win Leah over to her side. The girl was serious about showing herself well in running, because it was not difficult. But when starting, she tripped on her untied shoelace and fell. Lenton was standing next to her bed. He said dryly that he was glad she was okay and he had to go. Leah was so glad that it was just the two of them here. And when he had already turned around, she grabbed the hem of his t-shirt. She was silent and looked at him pitifully. He sighed heavily. The guy said that a lot of doubt settled in her soul. Leah decided that she could touch him, but he did not allow her to do this because she could just talk. Quite rudely, he reproached her for not being able to build adequate relationships with people, and he remembered their last meeting. He allowed himself to be touched only once, when Leah was dying. She finally knew how he felt, but she blamed only herself and her ability for her death. The girl looked at him with bewilderment as to why he fell silent and what he was thinking about. To break the silence, Lenton warned her and said that it was better not to use such an ability. Leah quickly began to ask all the questions that interested her, but he refused to give answers, which greatly damaged her pride. The last thing she asked, in all seriousness, was whether he was going to kill her father. Without unnecessary emotion, Lenton said that not now. He leaned close and whispered that he would eventually take his place, then turned and walked away. Lester was in his office discussing a new goal with someone. In his hands, he held a photograph of Lenton. At home, in silence and darkness, doing nothing, Ethan spent his day. But then his phone made a sound. Sarah wrote to him and asked if he could participate in the competition. Lenton appeared before his eyes. Ignoring previous messages, he asked when his friend's funeral would be. Sarah took it as a joke and sent Ethan a photo of him. He couldn't believe his eyes. Lenton rode alone in a crowded subway and wondered why he was fighting the Kosovo company. Because in the past, it was a bunch of dumbasses who pushed Ethan to gain superpowers. Before he awakened all his strength, these idiots died one after another. After several deadly skirmishes, he awakened all his powers and became invulnerable. This time, Lenton decided to cut the problem at the root. These invincible people are so different, but they all have one thing in common: they don't trust anyone. He was chased by a suspicious stranger, clearly working for Kosovo. Ethan ran through the noisy streets as far away from people as possible, the perfect plan ripening in his head. His goal was to meet with the head of Kosovo, so he needed to get caught by their mercenary as naturally as possible. He played the role of an ordinary schoolboy who does not understand anything very convincingly. The man reached out to grab him, but was kicked in the head. Ethan came to the rescue and ordered the man to get out. Lenton was beside himself with anger. His plan had been ruined, and Ethan was apologizing for what happened last time. He was sincerely glad that his friend was alive and that nothing threatened him now. But apparently the Kosovo mercenaries couldn't just give up either. A fight broke out between the man and Ethan. Lenton sat on the sidelines and waited, trying to figure out what to do now. A man was sitting on the roof of the building with a pistol. He took aim and fired. The bullet hit Ethan right in the neck, and he fell to the ground. Lenton was scared, because if he had already turned into a superhero, then all his efforts would go down the drain. He told the mercenary not to touch his friend. They both had bags placed over their heads and tied up. At this time, Sarah was trying to reach him and was very worried why he was not answering. Ethan woke up all alone from a loud noise. He raised his head and looked around. He was sitting in a windowless room. It was illuminated by a dim lamp, and he himself was tightly tied up. The source of the noise was most likely some kind of radio in the corner of the room. Lenton's familiar, surprisingly calm voice was heard behind him. He said he woke up almost 4.5 hours ago. Ethan asked if he was tied up and turned around, frozen in horror. His friend was standing on the back of a chair with his hands tied and a rope around his neck. Lenton blamed Ethan for everything that happened and said that everything would have been fine if he hadn't interfered in his own business. The future superhero was very nervous, but promised to come up with something and get them out of here. With a sharp movement, he hit the chair and himself against the wall, hoping to break it. Lenton any delight. He asked him to move his chair more comfortably so that he would not fall. He had been standing for several hours, leaning on the toes of his right foot. Ethan began to jump in his direction. He tried to carefully move the chair with his knee, but he accidentally dropped him, Lenton's only support, and he hung in the air. The rope squeezed his throat. He began to choke. Panic gripped them both. Ethan fell to the floor at that very second and picked up the chair with his teeth, bringing it closer to his friend. Lenton rested his toes on it. The guys exhaled. Deathly silence reigned, interrupted by noisy sighs. It took them about a minute to calm down. Smiles appeared on their faces and they laughed loudly. Ethan said that although they had known each other for a very long time, he had never heard Lenton laugh like that. And he said that if he died in his arms before he achieved his goal, he would never forgive him. These words made the hero happy, because a person without a goal is just a vessel who can only breathe. He recalled how he had saved Lenton from bullies more than once in the past. Previously, he was an empty vessel. He didn't care deeply about everything and everyone, even himself. And no matter how hard Ethan tried to support his friend, he had little success. He cannot control other people's thoughts and feelings. He said that it doesn't matter to him what Lenton's goal is, he will definitely achieve it. Because it's great to know that he's finally alive. These words confused the guy, but at that moment the door opened. Lester stood on the threshold. He was about to begin the interrogation. Over the course of 30 years, this method of interrogation became his favorite. He perfectly demonstrated the elements of proper interrogation. Lester picked Ethan up from the floor, and then he turned to Lenton and asked if he understood what he was talking about. The guy pretended to be a fool and said that the radio was interrupting everything and he couldn't hear anything. This infuriated the man, and with a sharp movement he knocked the chair out from under his feet. Holding Lenton's face with his hand, he muttered through his teeth that he hardly looked like someone you could kindly talk to. Ethan could not watch his friend being tortured. He screamed loudly and rushed forward, breaking the ropes. Lester recalled that Lenton is just a schoolboy, but has already made serious enemies who want to kill him. The guy tried to pretend that he didn't understand what he was talking about, but the man said that then he could act in a bad way and picked up the phone. Our main character panicked and asked if he would be protected if he told everything. Lester realized that on the other hand he was still a child, the same age as his daughter, and there is no benefit to killing him because extracting information from a dead man will not work. The guy asked him to come a little closer and whispered that some people are not at all what they seem. Grabbing the rope with his hands, he pulled himself a little higher and kicked him in the face. The man flew into the table, and Lenton quipped that the knots were very easy to untie. He tried to get up, but Ethan stopped him so his friend could escape. But running away was not at all part of his plans. He hung here for 5 hours and endured this guy's antics for half a day, waiting for the right moment. He pressed a hidden button in the wall and Lester found himself in a cage. Lenton confidently approached the trap and said that his whole long investigation was sheer stupidity because he didn't even know his name. And then he proudly and smugly introduced himself as Panlos. Then he said that now it was his turn to conduct the interrogation. Lester could not help but laugh. He said that he was not so stupid as not to take care of escape routes. He still had the phone in his hand. He dialed the number. The beeps began to ring. Lenton began to beg him to stop. He didn't know who the bandit would call, but there was only one person in his life for whom he sincerely cared, his Aunt Martha.